Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Now we come to the last artist of Volume 2 of Disney's They Drew As They Pleased, the 1940s. David Hall. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 5. David Hall. David always came to work dressed in a jacket, a tie, and French cufflinks. He was a very pleasant person to be around and hugely talented. William Kreber about David Hall. In the eyes of many animation historians and enthusiasts, David Hall is one of the most revered of Disney's concept artists. But in 1939, David Hall was way ahead of his time and did not fit in at the Disney studio. David Samuel Hall was born in Northern Ireland to American parents on September 23, 1905. According to his daughter-in-law, Jane, he loved to draw, and he always said, "I don't remember a day in my life that I didn't draw." That's what he wanted to do, and that's what he did all his life. He just had a great passion, and everyone enjoyed seeing what he drew. David's father and two uncles were in the business of importing distilled spirits from Ireland to the United States. In October of 1916, the family returned to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they'd lived before moving to Ireland. A few years later, they moved to Los Angeles, where David attended Hollywood High School and then the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. By 1928, David had joined the Fox Film Corporation, what would later become 20th Century Fox, as part of their art department, handling set decoration for Raoul Walsh's The Red Dance. By 1929, he had been promoted to art director on another Raoul Walsh movie, Hot for Paris. As art director, he tackled classics like Dante's Inferno from 1935 with Spencer Tracy, John Ford's Wee Willie Winkie from 1937, and The Three Musketeers from 1939 with Don Amici and the Ritz Brothers. Towards the end of 1938, Hall met artist Phil Dyke, an art instructor at the Disney studio, and the man who, along with Don Graham, had helped establish Disney's training program in the mid-1930s. Phil, already officially a member of Disney's color department, was also in charge of locating new talent for the studio. He apparently liked what he saw in Hall. On January 19th, 1939, he wrote David a letter. "Dear Mr. Hall, I have intended for several weeks to contact you in regard to the possibility of an affiliation with the studio. As I explained when you were in to see me, it would be wise to get the opinion of various department heads in regard to where you might best fit into the organization. Would it be possible for us to arrange a time in the near future for a conference with the head of our personal department to discuss the actual advantages with the studio?" What happened next remains a mystery of sorts. According to Joe Grant, however, Hall was hired on the sly, which led to his being dismissed fairly quickly. Disney executive Hal Adelquist had decided to go off on his own and do his idea of Alice in Wonderland, and brought this fellow David Hall in and put him in a room. He wouldn't let anybody in to see what he was doing. Finally, he presented the boards to Walt, and Walt didn't like it. In the first place, it was so far from the style of British illustrator John Tenniel. There was no business in it. They were just straight illustrations, which to Walt would be useless. He was looking for ideas. It was representational work. It was an arrogance on the executive's part, and Walt disliked the stuff based on the fact that Adelquist did it underhandedly. Things like that happen. Artist Herb Ryman shared the same story, though he remembered that it was Disney's director, David Hand, rather than Hal Adelquist, that put David Hall in a room to work. The dapper artist in Hollywood. Regardless of who actually hired him, Hall joined Disney's story department on March 1st, 1939, and immediately started working on Alice in Wonderland in an office away from the main Disney studio on Hyperion Avenue at 861 Seward Street, where the team that was developing Bambi was also located. 6'3", always dapper and smoking a pipe, Hall was a towering presence, a gentleman, and a workaholic. Art director William Kreber, who worked with David near the end of his career in the 1960s, had this to say about him. David was a very friendly man. He was a very pleasant person to be around and hugely talented. He always came to work in a jacket, a tie, and French cufflinks. He was very neat and highly organized where he worked. The workspace was always perfect. Before he would leave at night, he would empty his water, which was in a crock on his desk. He would clean all his brushes, and in the top drawer of his desk he would align all his brushes by size. After they were cleaned and carefully groomed, he would put everything away and wipe the desk clean. As I recall, there was nothing on the desk, and then the watercolor paper that he used was stored. He had a place for that too, and it was then all out of the view. Dressed in an elegant three-piece suit in a neat environment of his own making, David Hall never stopped drawing. He drew really fast, recalled his daughter-in-law Jane Hall. A lot of times they'd be little pictures. Sometimes they'd be bigger, but he would draw for the ideas and then he would refine them on another piece of paper. There was always a lot of paper around. He was very meticulous, added William Kreber, and it was mostly ink and watercolor. In his first few months at Disney, Hall drew more than 400 pieces of story art to present his vision for Alice in Wonderland. His creations were elaborate, highly rendered, and rather close to the look of the book's original drawings by John Tenniel. David's style combined the best of book illustration and live-action design. It was stimulating, inventive, and very far from the cartoony world of his concept artist predecessors Albert Herder and Ferdinand Horvath. Despite what Joe Grant and Herb Ryman claimed many years later, Walt must have been aware of David Hall's presence at the studio since his name appeared in notes of a story conference about Alice held on June 12, 1939, which Walt is bound to have read at the time. But Hall was working at 861 Seward Street, far from the main studio, which gives credibility to Herb Ryman's claim that at some point David Hand or Hal Adelquist sprung the artwork on Walt. Walt had mentioned in a story meeting that his artists would have to sort of adapt Tenniel's drawings to our own style. I think adding cute little coloring would add fascination to it. David Hall's drawings were visually striking, graphically exciting, and often surreal. They were not cute, however, which probably explains why so little of his work was included in the final movie when it was released more than 10 years later in 1951. Alice's cat Dinah and the White Rabbit's spectacles, two details that Hall introduced in his drawings that do not exist in Tenniel's illustrations, are the exceptions. And here's a picture he did of Tinker Bell for Peter Pan. From Wonderland to Neverland. For years, historians believed that Hall's work at Disney had been mostly limited to Alice in Wonderland. The hundreds of drawings he had created for that movie seemed enough to have filled the 15 months he spent at the studio. And yet he was heavily involved in at least 3 other projects beyond Alice in Wonderland. Hall created a handful of realistic drawings for Bambi that helped visualize the sequence in which the animals flee the presence of man in the forest. Those drawings have the visual strength that one usually attributes to artist Retta Scott's work on that same movie. But it is on Peter Pan that Hall's imagination really roamed free once again. For that movie, as for Alice in Wonderland, Hall never stopped drawing, and whereas for Alice in Wonderland he had worked both in graphite, pencil, and in color, for Peter Pan he seemed to switch fully to ink and watercolor paintings. With those luminous and often fanciful renderings, Hall expressed his vision for most of the scenes of the movie. From the nursery to the island of Neverland, from the meetings with the pirates to the encounter with the sirens and the lost boys. Some of those drawings are so striking, Captain Hook dining with Tiger Lily, Peter at the helm of the pirate ship, that one is bound to believe that Walt must have been at least intrigued by Hall's visual ideas. But Peter Pan was another of the ill-fated projects that would only be completed in the 1950s. When production was halted by Walt on January 23rd, 1941, David Hall's concepts were shelved. Before his departure, David was able to give one last bow on the Disney stage. On Wednesday, May 29th, 1940, just 3 days before he was laid off, David took a part in a story conference which included artists Hamilton Lusk, Jim Landley, T. Hee, Hal Sloan, Ray Jacobs, and Burke Anthony. Throughout this session, Hall presented the storyboards he had created for the cartoon adaptation of the book The Reluctant Dragon, which in 1941 became part of the movie of the same featuring Robert Benchley visiting the Disney studio. And so, for the first and last time, we hear Dave's voice in a story meeting. The conversation reveals that Hall's style was not embraced by his colleagues. After Hall's presentation of the story continuity, his colleague Jim Handley started the questioning aimed at improving the boards. Did you have any reason for staging it this way rather than have the kid hear the voice and go over to find the dragon behind the rock? I think you have more of suspense by him not knowing what it is, countered Hall. Couldn't you get it in the other way too? It only has more suspense this way, and the discussion went on, with the artists passionately arguing about the story and the staging. Towards the end, however, artist T. Hee voiced a concern that might have stung somewhat. I think Dave's board is overdrawn. This is quite possible because I tried to use some things out of the book, answered Hall, who had in mind the drawings of the great British illustrator Ernest Shepard, who illustrated the Winnie the Pooh books. To the Disney artists, used to the cartoony style of Albert Herder and Ferdinand Horvath, or to the stylized designs of Gustav Tengren and Kai Nielsen, however, the flurry of lines and details in Hall's drawings must have seemed overwhelming. Hall's Reluctant Dragon drawings could not be located, and we may never know what T. Hee and Jim Handley saw that day, but it is clear that Hall's style was not easily accepted at Disney in the early 1940s. On June 1st, 1940, as the studio started to feel the financial pinch of World War II, Hall was laid off along with several of his colleagues, including Phil Dyke, Herman